Just a week ago, I told you right away, in the coming weeks, Bitcoin's movement, like most global assets, will be determined not by company reports, nor by the words of individual officials, and not even by local statistics, but solely by the development of the conflict in the Middle East. Because a very simple and clear logic has emerged in the market. The more intense the escalation around Iran, the higher the oil prices. The higher the oil, the more inflationary risks grow. And when the market starts fearing inflation again, the riskiest assets are the first to take a hit: stocks, cryptocurrency, and the tech sector. But alongside this chain of events, another scenario began to take shape. A scenario where Trump tries to close this story as quickly as possible, show strength, declare victory, and restore market confidence. In such a model, the US puts an end to the Middle East crisis. Oil prices pull back, inflationary pressure eases, and markets find a reason for a powerful upward reversal. This is the version many analysts are betting on now, especially after Trump's own statements that the war could end very soon. And the reaction of financial platforms to these words was very telling. The market has once again made it clear that the Middle East, and Iran in particular, remains the key driver for oil prices, indices, and, of course, Bitcoin, which has started approaching critical levels again. But a logical question arises here. If everything is truly heading toward a quick conclusion, then why are major nations discussing emergency measures to stabilize the oil market? Why is the G7 raising the issue of strategic reserves? Why does tension persist in the media, even though official rhetoric sounds as if the resolution is near? And most importantly, how can anyone talk about an imminent victory when there hasn't been a full-scale ground operation yet, and the power within Iran hasn't changed? In fact, we see a situation where Washington is trying to sell the markets the image of a near end. But the actual mechanism of this finale is not entirely clear. Moreover, some former members of the American establishment are already saying outright that such statements could be a way to pressure the market and calm panic, while the White House lacks a full and final solution. So, the main question now is, what happens next? Are we really in for a quick finale, a drop in oil, and a Bitcoin pump? Or will it drag on, with the US getting bogged down in a conflict without a clear resolution, while a new surge in oil prices hits the entire economic model Trump promised his voters? Because his political framework has always been perfectly clear: cheap gasoline, affordable goods, support for small businesses, stable inflation, and growing markets. Any major war in the Middle East shatters this picture almost instantaneously. And the issue here isn't just about geopolitics as such. The problem is the cost of time. The longer the conflict continues, the more expensive it becomes for Washington. And we're not just talking about direct campaign costs, but deeper damage. A hit to approval ratings, rising public anxiety, pressure on the oil market, and the risk of destroying that image of a strong yet economically stable America that Trump is trying to maintain before the election. For him, a prolonged war isn't just a military risk. It's a political, economic, and reputational risk all at once. That's why the White House today is thinking not only about how to pressure the enemy, but also how to prevent an energy shock. And that's exactly where the talk of potentially using reserves, emergency stabilization measures, and constant signals that the conflict is supposedly nearing its end comes from. This is a message to everyone at once: markets, oil traders, American voters, and his own party. The logic is simple: convince everyone this isn't a new Iraq or an endless war, but a short, tough operation with a very quick conclusion. And as long as oil actually reacts to this rhetoric by dropping, the White House strategy seems to be working. As soon as the fear subsides, the markets instantly come back to life. Oil goes down, stock indices bounce back, and cryptocurrency starts to feel significantly more confident. We can already see how closely these movements are interconnected right now. When oil prices drop, Bitcoin immediately gets a chance to rise. When oil spikes on new risks, crypto instantly starts to get nervous and lose ground. This inverse correlation is particularly evident today. But there's one serious problem. Iran apparently has no intention of playing by the American script. The window for a quick diplomatic exit is looking narrower and narrower. A harder line is strengthening within the country, meaning that instead of a convenient deal partner, Washington could get an even more difficult and uncompromising opponent. And this is where the most unpleasant part for Trump begins. He wants a short victory story, but the enemy could force a long and exhausting conflict on him. That's why the markets are literally living from headline to headline right now. Any statement, any rumor, any change in the military situation is instantly reflected in the price of oil and through it in stocks and crypto. If we take a sober look at the overall picture, it becomes clear. So far, the market is leaning more towards believing in a quick conflict. That's why we've already seen a strong recovery in risk appetite, capital returning to American stocks, and a new attempt by Bitcoin to hold above key levels. From a military standpoint, the US superiority over Iran is indeed too great to question the outcome of a direct confrontation. The gap in technology, intelligence, satellite support, strike precision, and air defense capabilities is just too wide. So the question now isn't about who is stronger. The only question is exactly how the final point will be made. This is where we come to the most important turning point of this whole story, because many still see victory only as an old scenario from the last century. Tanks enter the capital, the government changes, and the country ends up under external control. But in reality, modern conflicts have worked differently for a long time. Today, victory is very often considered not a full seizure of territory, but the achievement of a specific strategic result. Destroy military infrastructure, deprive the enemy of the ability to strike, break logistics, paralyze channels of pressure on allies, and then declare that the key goals of the operation have been met. If you really take a careful look at the situation through that particular lens, it actually becomes quite clear why Trump does not actually need to have a major ground campaign in order to declare victory. Washington has already done the main thing, launched a series of powerful strikes on military sites, air defense systems, weapons depots, missile infrastructure, and the hubs through which Iran maintained its military resilience. So we're not just talking about demonstrative attacks for the sake of a television image. We're talking about a consistent weakening of the potential that allowed Tehran to keep the region in constant tension. If after this, Iran begins to reduce the activity of its allied structures in the Middle East, cuts pressure through proxies, or at least temporarily steps back from harsh escalation, the White House could well present this as a result of its own victory. That's why the final definition of victory for Trump could look very simple. Not as the seizure of Iran, but as the neutralization of a threat. Not as regime change, but as the destruction of that regime's ability to inflict critical damage on the interests of the US and its partners. For the domestic American audience, this is more than enough, especially if it's accompanied by falling oil prices, reduced market anxiety, and the feeling that the White House quickly restored order and didn't drag the country into another endless war. But there is one point without which such a story cannot be fully sold, and that is the Strait of Hormuz. Because as long as the threat to shipping remains, as long as tankers do not feel completely safe, as long as the market allows for the risk of supply disruptions, it is too early to talk about full stabilization. Without resolving this issue, Trump will not be able to confidently put a neat political end to it and present everything that happened as a fully completed and successful operation. That is why the fate of the strait is now becoming no less important than the military phase of the conflict itself. Here, Washington indeed has two visible paths. The first is the use of force. This is a scenario in which the United States quickly increases military pressure around the entire strait zone, clears potential threat points, expands intelligence surveillance, and effectively creates a safety corridor for tankers to pass through. Yes, this option is expensive. Yes, it requires additional escort resources, constant monitoring, and high readiness for new incidents. But on the other hand, it is precisely what gives the White House a quick tool to demonstrate that a key global artery is once again under control. The second path, more familiar to Trump, is pressure through the economy and the negotiation architecture. In this version, the bet is on making the continuation of the blockade too disadvantageous for Iran itself. After all, Tehran's problem is that the strait is important not only for other people's oil, but also for its own. If exports start to collapse through it, if supplies are hit, if interaction with key buyers, primarily China, becomes more difficult, then further escalation starts to hit Iran itself, and with double the force. And in such a model, the United States does not even have to go too far. It is enough to increase the pressure so that the price of continuing the conflict becomes too high for Tehran. That is why I still believe that the general vector remains the same. Iran's military potential will continue to decline, and the financial costs of this conflict will only grow. Moreover, the longer this drags on, the worse Iran's own situation becomes, because destroyed infrastructure, export restrictions, pressure on logistics, and the risk of further isolation are no longer a matter of loud political statements, but a matter of economic survival. And in this structure, Tehran's window for maneuver is gradually narrowing. But for Trump, on the contrary, there is almost no time left. He simply cannot afford to stretch this story out for months, because war will turn from a factor of strength into a factor of weakness and will start to hit harder at his economic agenda, his promises of cheap fuel, consumer sentiment, small businesses, markets, and of course political ratings before the congressional elections. It is now critically important for him to resolve the conflict within a foreseeable time frame, and in such a way that it looks like a tough but controlled success. And here, the answer to the question of whether this is positive for Bitcoin is actually quite obvious. Yes, absolutely, it is positive, because Bitcoin is currently extremely sensitive to any reduction in macro tension. If the market stops expecting a new spike in oil prices and consequently a renewed acceleration of inflation, then the yield-seeking mode kicks in again, and with it, the appetite for risk returns. And that is why right now it's necessary to follow not only the Bitcoin chart, but also the news surrounding Iran and oil, literally in real time. Because any new signal regarding the Strait of Hormuz, negotiations, new strikes, or White House rhetoric is immediately reflected across the entire market. Today, geopolitics is not just a backdrop, it is one of the primary drivers of price. And until this story is finally resolved, it will be the factor determining how confidently Bitcoin can move forward.